In this lecture, we will set up the player object as well as the 3 extra lives that we will put on the bottom right hand side of the screen. Let's define a function called player spawn and pass in 2 parameters, the turtle and the screen. Since this function will modify the values of player and can player do action, we will need to define these using the global keyword at the top of our program. The following block of conditional statements checks how many lives the player has left based on our global lives variable. Lives can be any value between 0 and 4, since the player starts on the screen and has 3 extra lives, making it a total of 4. If the code gets inside of this if statement, it is the start of the game. We will create the turtle and set its appearance. If the code gets inside of this elif statement, the player has lost 1 life. The player variable is set to the leftmost extra life on the bottom of the screen, which we will move into position and use as the new player. First, we will set the player equal to that life variable holding the turtle object. Next, we lift the turtle up off the screen so that it doesn't draw when we move it into position. After that, we will set the turtle size to 8, the size of our previous player object. We will then move the new player object into position. After resizing, positioning, and setting the player's speed, we will allow the player to move and shoot by changing the value of the can player do action boolean variable to true. The next 2 elif statements will follow the same pattern, so I will speed the video up a bit. If the player has 2 lives left, the player variable will be set to the middle extra life. Else if the player has 1 life left, the player variable will be set to the rightmost extra life. Lastly, we come to the else condition. This is in the case that the player has no more lives. It hides the rest of the game graphics and displays a game over message to the player. First, we hide the 3 enemy objects. Next, we hide the player object. We also hide the graphics of player shot, the missile that the player shoots. We will call the function drawGameOver and pass in t, our global turtle variable, and s, our global screen variable. We have not defined the drawGameOver function yet, so we will get an error if we try to run our code with this line in it. Let's comment it out for now so that we can still run our code and see our progress. The next function to write is the setPlayerLives function, which will be responsible for setting the player's extra lives in the bottom left-hand side of the screen. We are going to modify 3 global variables in this function, life, life1, and life2. Let's use the global keyword to alert Python that we will be modifying these variables in this function. We will use a for loop to go through the player lifenums list variable that we defined at the top of our program. This will give us access to the order of the objects in our player lives list. Once we have the index of the object, we will set the respective life variable, life, life1, or life2, to a turtle object that we create. Then, we set the placeholder object in the player lives list to whichever life variable that we defined. If I equals 0, then this is the first item in the list since indexing starts at 0 in Python. Therefore, we set the life variable equal to a new turtle object. Next, we set the variable at position I, or index of 0, object in the player lives list to the turtle object that we just created. We repeat this process for the next 2 conditional statements, for the life1 and life2 variables respectively. The next step after that block of conditional statements is for us to hide the turtle, so that we can change the color, size, shape, and position without the player of our game seeing it. We only want the player to see the extra lives in their final state. We want to hide the things we are doing to create it from the player's view. After setting the speed, color, and shape of the turtle, we want to lift the turtle up off of the screen so that it doesn't draw to the screen when we move it. The following code moves the object into its position on the bottom right-hand side of the screen. This line uses the I variable to make the position depend on which life variable we are up to. Having this spacing would be dependent on the variable I instead of a hard-coded value like 3 makes it a lot easier if we want to change the number of extra lives the player has later on when developing. Lastly, we show the turtle again once it is now in its final position and all of its settings are correctly modified. We need to dedent the two functions we just wrote as they are indented one tab too far in, and Python will throw an error if we try to run the code without dedenting these functions. Let's test the code we just wrote. Later on, we will move these two function calls into another function we will write to group all of the game initialization code together. Calling these two lines should result in you now seeing the player and the extra lives be positioned correctly onto your screen. If that doesn't happen, this means that you should check the console as an error was probably thrown and something was probably typed in incorrectly.